Hey YouTube, James Sane here. So a quick video on ND filters. So if you're trying to shoot outside in bright sunlight and you can't shoot at the settings that you want, then ND filter might be the solution. Okay, today we're going to talk about a couple of the K&F concept filters, the variable neutral density filters. What I like about them is that they're glass, they're coated, and you don't get that X pattern that you do on some of the cheaper ND filters. I like the variable ND filters, that way you can dial in, it gives you more leeway, it's more easy to work with, it's more convenient. So I've collected some filters over the years. They do come in different filter sizes that they screw onto the front of your lens. What you probably should do is take your largest lens setting, which like I happen to have a 72mm opening, buy some adapter rings, 20-25 bucks. I'll leave links in the description below. So buy the largest ND filter that fits your largest opening lens, and then just use adapters to put it on a smaller 67 or 58mm open, because typically you're going to shoot at 24-30 frames a second. Somewhere in that ballpark you might be shooting at 60 frames a second, so your shutter speed is traditionally set at double your frame rate. So for example, I'm shooting at 30 frames a second here on the Canon 80D, and I'm shooting at 1/60th of a second, and I want to shoot at 1.8. I like the f1.8 or the f2.0 for the cinematic look, the nice blurred background. And I do, so if I'm gonna have a fixed shutter and a fixed f-stop, the only thing that I can adjust on the camera is the ISO. I would prefer to shoot at a low ISO, 400 or less, preferably 100 or 200, to give a less grainy look. So if I have a fixed shutter speed and a fixed f-stop and a fixed ISO, the only thing left that I can control is how much light is hitting the sensor on the camera, and that's what I do with a neutral density filter. So I have a couple of the K&F concept filters that I have bought. This particular one is the K&F concept. It's a 72mm opening because I want to fit the largest lens, and it's an ND2 to ND32. All right, so the nomenclature that K&F use, so an ND2 gives you 1 f-stop reduction, and ND4 gives you 2 f-stop reductions, ND8 3 f-stop reductions, and on. So this particular filter has a 5-stop range, and that's fine if you're shooting in open shade, if you're shooting indoors, but if you're out in bright sunlight, that may not get you to where you want to be. So when I shoot outside in direct sunlight, I need a stronger ND filter. I also have the K&F concept ND8 to ND2000. So the minimal amount of neutral density that you can apply is 3 f-stops. So this will stop you down 3 stops, and then it has 9 more stops that you can work with. So very versatile. So let's take a look at some examples when you're shooting outside in brighter light than inside, when you're either in open shade or direct sunlight, and then having the range so that you can shoot at the f-stop and the shutter speed that you want and still maintain a low ISO. So what you can control is how much light hits the sensor, and we'll also talk about how do you go through the steps getting the proper exposure. So let's get to the videos. Okay, so this is direct sunlight, f14, ISO 250, not the cinematic look that you want. Even when you get closer to the camera, you still don't get that look. Now with the neutral density filter, we can achieve f1.8 for a much more cinematic look, much improved over the last video. If you position yourself closer to the camera and have even more distance between you and the background, you can achieve even a more cinematic look, much better bokeh. Here we have f16 in open shade, not that good. The background is too distracting. Shooting at f5.0, a little better, but not that much better. Now here's f1.8 with a neutral density filter and a much better blurred background, much more cinematic. To make the effect more dramatic, all I've done is move closer to the camera, putting more distance between myself and the background objects. Alright, so I want to shoot at 30 frames a second because this camera doesn't have 24 frames per second. So the traditional rule is to have your shutter speed double your frames per second. So I'm shooting at 1/60th of a second, and I'm going to shoot at f 1.8. I want that nice blurred background, and I can shoot at ISO 100, 200, 300. I want a lower ISO so that I get a smoother picture. So here I have a gray card held up in front of the camera. I press my shutter button halfway. I already have the neutral density filter screwed on. So the only thing I'm going to change now is how much light is the sensor receiving. So I just change my f-stop. I dial it in. Gotta hit the shutter button halfway. Make the screen darker as I dial in. So there's the perfect exposure with this neutral density filter shooting at 1/60th of a second at f1.8 at an ISO of 100. It has a 5 range f-stop, so this is an example of it being oops, bumped that camera. This is an example of being too dark, underexposed, where I would just dial back. So my shutter speed's fixed, my f-stop is fixed, and my ISO is fixed. Press the shutter button halfway, then adjust the neutral density filter. That's too dark, that's too light by 1.5 stops. Shutter button halfway again, dial it back in, and then there's my proper exposure for this particular lighting. So hopefully this helps to your understanding and trying to get exposure when you know that you want to shoot at a certain frame rate, you know you want to shoot at a certain shutter speed, and you want your f-stop to be wide open so that you're getting a blurred background. So the only two variables you can then change is the ISO, and the higher the ISO, the more noisy your image will be. So if you can use a variable neutral density filter, you can dial in and get your exposure exactly where you want it. Thanks. Okay, so some final thoughts on the K&F ND filters. The variable neutral density filters, I like them a lot. Here I'm going to put the ND2 to 32 onto my Canon 85mm f1.8 lens. I'm using some stepping rings. This is a 58mm opening. And I have to step up 3 times. This is the 58 to 62, 62 to 67, and 67 to 72 millimeter, so that I can use the same 72 millimeter ND filter on every lens that I have. So one thing I really like about this particular filter is that as you rotate from minimum to maximum, there are hard stops. Now it doesn't click at each stop in between, but you can't go past the minimum, and as you rotate, you can't go past the maximum. On the K&F Concept ND8 to 128, it does not have hard stops as you're rotating from minimum to max. And that's kind of irritating because sometimes you're behind the camera and you're just reaching around looking at your screen, and as you adjust this, it just keeps going. You go past minimum and then you come back around, now you're at maximum. So it's nice that it has 9 stops of neutral density, but I wish it had the hard stop at maximum and the hard stop at minimum. Okay, so I hope this helps in your decision-making process and helps lead to smart purchase decisions. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you.